So, as everyone I'm sure is well aware, we had quite a fire event on Labor Day a year ago. And this has given a lot of us who do research and are generally interested in wildfire issues the opportunity to raise public awareness about fire hazard, especially in what we call the wildland-urban interface right here in the Front Range of Colorado. This is an outreach talk in which I'm going to summarize some of the findings from research on fire history that we've conducted since about 1981 in Colorado. I'll present a few examples of the kinds of data that we work with, but for the most part I'm going to present findings and interpretations as is appropriate for this kind of outreach presentation. So just a quick reminder. About 6,000 acres burned in the 4 Mile Canyon fire last Labor Day. This was the most costly fire in the modern history of Colorado. And it has triggered a lot of current political activities, ballot issue, for example. There's a lot of discussion about how we can either mitigate or adapt to these sorts of fires. And what I'll talk about today is meant to be background that can inform some of that discussion. I'll give you sort of a basic primer on fire history along the elevational gradient of forest types from low elevations here in the Front Range, so the area that we refer to as the lower ecotone, between the ponderosa pine woodlands and the plains grasslands, and then continue all the way up to the subalpine zone of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir forests. What we're really concerned with is the zone that we call the montane zone, which is somewhat arbitrarily divided into two elevational zones, the lower montane zone and the upper montane zone, which in Boulder County is defined by about 7,500 feet, but depending on whether you're on a north aspect or a south-facing aspect. So very roughly, the difference in vegetation types occurs at about 7,500 feet, where to the lower elevations we have more open ponderosa pine, somewhat mixed with Doug fir. And then as we go to higher elevation, ponderosa pine is still dominant throughout the montane zone, but we start to get a much greater mixture with Douglas fir and with lodgepole pine. So most of this area would be below the elevation of the peak-to-peak highway to help you sort of place it. To study fire history, we go out and we cut usually partial cross sections. All this was taken from a dead tree, so we cut a complete cross section. These are from live trees, non-destructive samples. They don't kill a tree. We obviously don't go all the way to the center for a live tree. And we can identify the exact year of past fires by dating the tips or points of the wounds produced by the fire damage. And then using the pattern of annual tree rings, we're able to date each individual fire. So that's sort of our basic source of data. We also go into stands and age all the trees. This is an example of a stand consisting of even-sized diameters, even-sized trees. It's also an even-aged stand in the sense that all those trees established in a very short period of time, 5, 10, maybe 20 years following a fire. And then we relate those structures to an actual fire event, such as the recent one, to come up with a history of the frequency of past fires and also information on how severe past fires have been. So starting at low elevations here, this is El Dorado Springs. This is one of our sample sites. In fact, this is the lowest elevation site in the Front Range for which we have any fire history data. Along this hogback, we would search around for fire-scarred trees, cut partial cross-sections, bring those cross-sections back to the lab, sand them up, and date the fire scars. And then this information can be summarized in a very simple form where this diagram shows the percentage of the trees that we cut samples from, which in this case would have been about 30 trees. that recorded fires in these individual years. So this bar, for example, would show that in the 1780s or so, we had about, well, exactly 1786, we had close to 80% of the trees that had been sampled over an extensive area, about well over 100 acres, recorded fire in the same exact year. Clearly evidence that we had widespread fire in that year. Then we also would age the trees, and as you can see in this diagram here, when we plot up the tree ages over an extensive area, you can see that there are relatively few trees that were present in the sample area prior to the late 1800s. And then following about 1880 or so, we get fairly abundant tree establishment, which also corresponds to a decline in the number of years recording any fire. Here in the 1880s, 1890s, there's still a little bit of fire here in the early 1900s. And then after about 1915, in this area near El Dorado Springs, you can see there are no fire scars recorded at all. So this would be a typical example of where fire suppression really has been effective. So this is an example then of the typical kind of fire regime at the lowest elevations, right at the ecotone between the open ponderosa pine woodlands and the plains grasslands. When we look backwards in time from the beginning of the fire suppression period towards 1700, although you see a lot of variability here in terms of the intervals between years with fires, generally we had a fairly high fire frequency. On the average, we're getting at least some fire every 8 or 12 years. This is the pattern that most people are familiar with for ponderosa pine forests. This is a pattern that's been documented very extensively in Arizona, New Mexico. Sometimes we refer to it as sort of the southwestern ponderosa pine model of fire history. Given that kind of fire history, we know that many trees, because they record the scar of a fire, can survive the actual fire. Therefore, most of the fires that occur in that environment are non-lethal to mature trees. And that's typical, this kind of open environment here, which you see very close to Boulder. And the type of fire that burned in that environment in the past was mainly non-lethal to mature trees. These are high frequency and low severity fires. In other words, they occur frequently, but they don't do that much damage. They mainly just kill tree seedlings and prevent stands from becoming really dense. So they maintain open landscapes such as this. And then when managers try to mimic that kind of fire regime, they can go in and use prescribed burning to produce a very low severity fire. And so this is the kind of restoration paradigm that most people are well aware of. And this kind of paradigm has really driven a lot of the general thinking and the policy about mitigating fire hazards and about restoring landscapes. So one of my objectives this evening is to try and evaluate to what extent that paradigm applies to different places in the landscape in the Front Range. Obviously, it applies right here at the lowest elevations. There's plenty of evidence to support that kind of paradigm, such as historical photographs of the Chautauqua area here, taken in 1905 compared to 1985. And you can see that we had pretty open slopes that have filled in with dense stands of primarily, almost exclusively, ponderosa pine. So this fits what we refer to as the southwestern ponderosa pine model. During the 20th century of fire suppression in our region, beginning sometime around 1915 or 1920, we effectively suppressed fires, and under fire suppression, then trees have been able to invade those grassland areas. This is an example taken from Flagstaff Mountain in 1905, looking down on the Red Rocks area on the edge of Boulder. And as of a few weeks ago, that's the same scene. And you can see a fairly significant invasion of these areas by ponderosa pine. This is pretty well documented in a lot of low elevation ponderosa pine ecosystems around the western US. This is an example, the same process along Old Stage Road. It's also called Red Hill Valley. This was taken 1899 when we had pretty open slopes and just open woodlands of ponderosa pine. And then we had some infilling, especially in the back here, by ponderosa pine. We also had infilling with homes, which of course is the key issue here. And as many of you may remember, in 2009, we had a pretty extensive fire in this area, which was somewhat surprising that it was such an extensive fire even at very low elevations. In the lower montane zone and the lower ecotone with the plains grasslands where we have open ponderosa pine woodlands, so this is roughly below about 7,500 to 7,800 feet, the historic fire regime, in other words, the fire regime that existed before we started suppressing fires, consisted of these relatively frequent, low intensity, meaning that they did relatively little damage to mature trees, fires. The ignition sources consisted of both humans and lightning. The Native Americans were setting fires, but for the most part in this landscape, we don't have a lack of lightning, or lack of ignition sources. We've got plenty of lightning to start fires, so we don't have to depend on humans as an ignition source, but they do add to the number of fires. And as I said, the main effect was to kill tree seedlings and maintain low tree densities. In terms of the controls on this fire regime type, it's important to recognize that fire spread and severity are mainly limited by the amount of fuel, especially the amount of woody fuel, which is going to control the intensity or the severity of the fire. Based on the kinds of data that I showed you a minute ago, that's been collected at many different, I'll call them points, but they're really patches, across the landscape throughout the montane zone by people in my lab over the last 25 years or so, we're able to sort of fill in the blanks with some modeling approaches and produce maps of where we had a particular type of fire regime in the past. So the yellow color here at low elevations is a reconstruction then of what we call the high fire frequency type. That is the type that's associated with those lower ecotone areas of ponderosa pine. This map over here shows the variation in cover type from pure ponderosa pine through a mixture with ponderosa and Doug fir, and then towards higher elevations, the cover type, which is referred to as mixed conifer, which still includes dominance by ponderosa pine, but there's a greater abundance of Doug fir and lodgepole pine, a little bit of limber pine at higher elevation too. And this is just a measurement of the potential error in that kind of reconstruction. So the key point here is that when we put all of our data together and produce a spatial model is that only 20% of the surface area of the distribution of ponderosa pine fits that paradigm that I just described. That's a key point because most people think that everywhere that you have ponderosa pine, you should have low severity, high frequency fires. The entire management community is gradually moving towards a recognition that that idea does not apply everywhere to ponderosa pine, but it's been kind of a long struggle. So, a couple more comments about the lower montane zone before we move up to a bit higher elevation. I said that fire severity and fire spread are very much controlled by the lack of fuels, especially lack of woody fuels in this kind of fire regime. So that implies that our largest fire years, the years when we have the most extensive fire, should be not only dry years, but they should follow time periods where we had more abundant production of fuels. In other words, a year or 2 years before the actual fire, if you have above average moisture availability, cooler temperatures and more precipitation during the spring, then a year or 2 after that, you're going to have abundant grass fuels. And we find that that's exactly when we get the really widespread fire events in the lower montane zone. So it's not just a function of drought, but it's also a function of fuel buildup during those preceding or antecedent moisture periods. So that's illustrated in this map here, where we used our tree ring data to just show each one of our sample sites as a solid dot if we had fire scars in that year, in 1786. And the empty dots are the sample sites that had trees old enough, fire-scarred trees old enough to record a fire, but did not record fire in 1786. And as you can see, most of the dots are towards the lower elevations. So that fits very well with the idea that it's antecedent moisture availability producing an increase in the growth of grasses that then, a couple of years later, produces the really widespread fires. It turns out that 1786 follows by 2 years one of the strongest El Nino events in the tropical Pacific. Statistically, wetter, moister springs in Colorado, in the Front Range, are associated with El Nino events. And during the historic time period too, we also see that the El Nino phase is conducive then to subsequent fire occurrence a year or two after an El Nino event. Now, as we move to higher elevations, we still refer to the entire elevational zone as being characterized by mixed severity fire regimes, simply because at the lowest elevations in the ravines, you've got denser stands, you've even got some Doug fir, and you can have higher severity whole stand replacement type fires at the lowest elevations. But as we go up into the middle elevations and the higher elevations of the montane zone, but still only at 8,000, 8,500 feet or so, we get much denser stands, and under those fuel conditions, the typical fire is a stand replacing fire, at least over a patch of 50 acres, 100 acres, maybe 1,000 acres, something like that. But over sizable areas, we can have high severity fire events, but we know that historically, from the tree rings, that they were infrequent events. So just to contrast, the lower montane fire frequency, which you see here, with the upper montane fire frequency, we've plotted the data from one of our sample sites at about 8,100 feet. So this is up close to the peak-to-peak highway. And these percentages, again, are the trees that recorded fires in these individual years. You can see that we had really just a few years of high percentage of trees recording fires. And we've got some time periods here of many decades, close to 100 years, without any evidence of fire. This is something that 20 years ago was considered somewhat novel. Now people realize that yes, in the upper montane zone, we do have a fire regime that can be characterized by many decades without any fire occurrence, but then when a fire does occur, they are large and stand replacing events, high severity events. Again, during the 20th century, we see probable evidence of the effectiveness of fire suppression. But this time period, lacking fires in the 20th century, is not radically different from the length of earlier time periods lacking fires. So if we want to talk about forest health issues potentially being related to the effects of fire suppression, we have to consider the fact that in a lot of the upper montane zone, the last 80 years of fire suppression is not out of the ordinary. This is an example of a photograph of Left Hand Canyon taken in 1905. It's in a mining area, and we also know that many of the fires were started during the 19th century by settlers and miners, in addition to fires being initiated by lightning naturally. But this just illustrates that this landscape in the upper montane zone could support an extensive, high severity, stand replacing fire long before there were any possible effects of fire suppression. So we can't blame this kind of fire severity on the effects of fire suppression. And I'm stressing that because up until very recently, and still continues today to a certain extent, many people would look at a recent high severity fire and say, that's due to fire suppression and fuel buildup and it's a completely unnatural thing. Well, that idea applies only to low elevations, for example, right around Chautauqua. It generally does not apply to most of the landscape in the upper montane zone. There are some grassland areas, some small meadow areas in the upper montane zone where it would apply, but over most of the acreage in the upper montane zone, this is the typical pattern that we find. The upper montane zone fire regime then is referred to as a variable severity fire regime. It's also called mixed severity fire regime. But the key aspect is that here we have a very important role played by high severity fires. This is an important ecological point because when we talk about restoration, most people are talking about restoring those frequent low severity fires. They're not talking about restoring high severity fires. And because of that, we often have a lot of confusion then in terms of what the public expects about restoration when we go to higher elevations. So the fire frequency here at a stand level, let's say of 100 acres or so, was fairly moderate. Typically well over 30 years, and in some cases you'd have more than 100 years without a fire occurring. Again, the ignition sources were both lightning and Native Americans. But fire spread here is very strongly controlled by interannual climate variability, very strongly controlled by weather, very strongly controlled by what's referred to as the preconditioning of the fuels. So it's at these higher elevations where you only can get extensive fires when we have exceptional drought. Droughts like in the year 2002, for example. Now, in this upper montane zone, we have continuous woody fuels, so there's no lack of fuels for allowing severe fires. So we're always going to have a severe fire hazard there, and whether or not the fire actually occurs is dependent primarily on weather conditions. So one of the main fire effects in this zone, which has not been widely appreciated until the last few years, last 20 years anyway, is that the burning of the dense stands that was so widespread during the second half of the 19th century triggered abundant regeneration, new establishment of ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, some of the other tree species, but primarily Doug fir and ponderosa pine, so that when we drive up, say to the Peak-to-Peak Highway, we commonly see even-sized trees, dense stands. Those are quite even-aged. Most of them originated after fires that occurred somewhere between about 1850 and 1905 or 1910. So that means that when we walk into one of those dense stands of Doug fir, well, it applies to lodgepole pine as well, and we have a very high density of trees, that's really a natural response to the fires that occurred in the second half of the 19th century. It's not the result of suppressing fires. In other words, we haven't had trees come into a formerly open grassland to create those dense stands. High density is a natural feature of especially the Doug fir dominated and the lodgepole pine dominated, and also the ponderosa pine dominated stands towards the higher elevations. Without belaboring the data, I just want to sort of summarize quickly what we think fire suppression actually has accomplished in terms of changing the forest structure, the age structure. At low elevations here, when you look at a large data set on tree ages, we've got about 3,000 tree ages here, and you just divide the birth date, the establishment date of the trees, into time periods that would correspond to the fire suppression period, which we arbitrarily start at 1921 here. And then we've got a time period that's called the settlement period, beginning about the time of the beginning of mining activities. And then you could call this the Native American time period prior to about 1860. In the lower montane zone, we get an average of around 20-some% of the trees that did establish during the fire suppression period. That fits the old paradigm. It fits the southwestern ponderosa pine model. When we go up into the middle part of the montane zone and then the higher part of the montane zone, the percentages of trees that established during the fire suppression period are very low. the highest percentage we could find in any particular stand was just 24%. The average is down well below 10%. So this is just evidence of what I described verbally for you a second ago, that the high density of stands in the upper montane zones reflects very abundant tree establishment during the second half of the 19th century. As I mentioned, many fires were started intentionally as well as accidentally by humans during the settlement and mining era, but it turns out that this also was a time period of extreme drought that affected most of, well, all of the western North America, in fact. And this is a pattern there that we see in ponderosa pine forests all across the Rocky Mountain region. So it's not just increased numbers of fires set by humans, but it's also the fact that we had a much drier climate during the 19th century, or individual years and decades anyway, that were conducive for widespread fires. Now, I showed you this a minute ago, which is the typical pattern of a year of very widespread fire at the low elevations, the lower montane zone. That contrasts with this example here from 1859, where nearly all the fires are in the upper montane zone. And this was a year where clearly drought was controlling fire spread. It was not a year in which we had widespread fire because of the antecedent moisture conditions, which I explained for the pattern at the lower elevation. I mentioned that the increase in extent of burning in Colorado in general during the second half of the 19th century fits a pattern that applies to all of Western North America. This is a figure from a paper that several of us produced in 2007, where we combined our fire history data sets from many different areas. 7 authors got together. And we did a number of analyses, one of which was an analysis of the synchrony of fire occurrence over this huge area. And we were able to show that there's a high synchrony of fire occurrence that's related to the El Nino Southern Oscillation, El Nino in contrast to La Nina events, a larger sort of variation of that same tropical Pacific driver of climate, which affects many different parts of the world, which is known as the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and also what's known as the Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation. That's a variation in sea surface temperatures in the North Atlantic, which again has been shown by climatologists to be statistically very strongly related to drought all across Western North America. So the main point of this is just to show that what I'm describing for the Front Range is not unique in any way. It's in sync with how major climate drivers that are sort of indexed as sea surface temperatures in the tropical Pacific and at the North Atlantic are teleconnected, are related to weather variations that you hear about on your nightly news when we've got an El Nino event or a La Nina event. And so over a very large part of North America, you can have simultaneous fire occurrence. Just a couple comments about the subalpine zone. So when we get up above about 9,000 feet and we're into lodgepole pine and spruce fir forests, here the fire regime is characterized by quite infrequent fires. But when we do get a fire, they tend to be very widespread and they are completely stand replacing. They're very high severity fires. So after a typical lodgepole fire that I'm sure you've at least seen pictures of from the 1988 Yellowstone fires, there will be 100% tree mortality over hundreds or even thousands of acres. And again, the fire history work shows that the occurrence of those fire years tends to be synchronous over enormous areas in the Rocky Mountain region in relation to the various types of sea surface climate drivers of our weather variation. This is a fire that occurred about 1905 in Rocky Mountain National Park. Photo was taken in 1930. you can see that it has filled in you can, in the modern landscape, still detect the even-age stands that have originated after that burn. You can see it better over on Long's Peak here. Fire occurred again about 1905. This photograph was taken in 1916, still fairly open areas, and if you look very closely, maybe from the front row, in 1986 you can pick out the same pattern. So on air photos, we can look at those patterns and identify the even-aged stands, especially of lodgepole pine, that have established after those fires, which allows us then to map fire history over a very extensive area. One of the key findings for the subalpine zone is that when we get to the highest elevations in the spruce fir zone, about half the spruce fir zone in Rocky Mountain National Park has not burned at all in the last 400 years. So there's a lot of area, even though we think of fire as being, the controlling disturbance, there's a lot of area that historically has not burned very frequently in the high elevation forests. Okay, to come back to the original theme here, the 4 Mile Canyon fire, about half of the area that was burned in that event is in the lower montane and half in the upper montane zone. The severity of the fires in those elevational zones was exactly what we would expect based on our historical knowledge of fire severity over the last several hundred years. The higher elevations tended to have higher severity burns. The north-facing slopes that are moister and therefore have more fuels tended to have higher severity fires. So in general, the pattern of fire that occurred in the 4 Mile Canyon event is very consistent with fire behavior historically, which is a bit of a surprise to some people because there's been a lot of talk about how fire suppression and accumulation of fuels may have driven that kind of fire event, but there's really very little evidence to support that. This shows Sunshine Mining Camp, which now is in the area that was burned in 2010. You can see that some of the area was more open, a little bit of a tree invasion there, but not a radical change in stand density for the most part. This is a lower elevation area which fits the lower montane fire regime idea and the tree invasion and the accumulation of woody fuels idea. So this does fit the old paradigm. So we had pretty open slopes as photographed in 1898. There has been tree encroachment during the 20th century, and this is where we had moderately severe fires. This is pretty much the same scene in 1905 and then 1985, and then you can see that in 2010 this house was burned in that fire. As we go to a little bit higher elevation, however, in 4 Mile Canyon, in the upper montane zone, these are dense, even-sized stands. Trees are very similar in size. This is the typical kind of regrowth pattern that occurred after the 19th century fires. And this accounts for about half of the area that was burned. So here you don't have to postulate fuel accumulation during fire suppression as an important driver of the fire. These areas burned in pretty much the same way that they've been burning in the past. Yeah, this map just shows this location here of these two insets where in the early 1980s, when we first started our fire history work, we sampled in 4 Mile Canyon area. We sampled just slightly to the west of the limit of the current fire. And this just is evidence that in these particular years where we've plotted all the trees that recorded fire scars, 1894 and 1860, we had extensive fires in 4 Mile Canyon. Not worrying about the data here on the left, this photograph taken in 1905 of Sugarloaf here from the old Switzerland Trail in 4 Mile Canyon, the old railroad route. You can see that this area sustained a pretty intensive fire. This patch partially survived, but all this area was killed by fire. You're looking at snow here. And then this is the typical even-aged post-fire stand development, even-age recovery in 2011. This is Gold Hill in 1898. You can see that now in the upper montane zone, a little bit higher elevation, but still characterized by ponderosa pine and Doug fir, that we had pretty dense stands in some areas, but we had a mixture with some meadows, so it's getting more complicated in some places. And this is the area, part of the area that burned just to the edge of town. So these dense stands are clearly not the result of fire suppression. They were there long before we had any fire suppression. This is the same slope here, showing what looks like a fairly young post-fire stand that's probably recovering from that 1860 fire, which also burned the town of Gold Hill. And same stand today. So how does this inform public discussions of some of the management issues and some of the political solutions that are, well, at least one of them is on the ballot right now? It tells us that the risk of high severity fire is a natural feature of most of the ponderosa pine zone. Quantitatively, we can say at least 80% of the ponderosa pine zone historically was characterized by high severity fires. So we can't blame managers, we can't blame some past policy for creating a hazard. That's a completely natural feature of those ecosystems. And it means that we need to carefully consider the differences between restoration goals and fire mitigation goals. They don't always coincide. 20 years ago, many people argued that if we would just restore natural fire regimes, we would essentially reduce fire hazard. Well, that's only true for the ponderosa pine zone at the lowest elevation. When we go up to higher elevation, the upper montane zone, if we restored the natural fire regime, we would be restoring the infrequent occurrence of completely stand devastating high severity fires, which is not compatible with what most people want to see done in areas where they're living. People usually ask about the significance of recent bark beetle kill. So I've made a few generalizations here. As everyone knows, for the last 10 to 12 years, we've had widespread bark beetle activity in Colorado. And this is part of something that's going all across Western North America, from Southeast Alaska to Mexico. It is clearly related to climate warming. And the question comes up as to how is that potentially changing fire risk, which means just the probability of ignition, or fire hazard, the severity of fires. And my lab has done the only historic research using tree rings to reconstruct past spruce beetle, but other bark beetle outbreaks too. And we've generally been able to, not generally, specifically, we've been able to show that following the massive spruce beetle outbreak in northwestern Colorado in the 1940s, which killed about 90% of the timber volume of spruce over White River National Forest, over a vast area, it did not result in catastrophic fires. There was no increase in the frequency of fires or the extent of fires after that event. In the case of the mountain pine beetle outbreak that occurred here in Boulder County in the 1970s, no, we haven't had a massive increase in fires following that outbreak either. In the case of the mountain pine beetle outbreak that occurred in Lodgepole Pine in the 1980s, up in the Summit County area, same area that's being so hard hit now. Likewise, following that, we did not have catastrophic fire. So historically, we can say that bark beetle outbreaks do not inevitably result in catastrophic fire, even though intuitively, most people believe that all those dead trees should be increasing the probability of fire occurring or the severity of fire. There's been a lot of modeling research to examine that sort of question. And the results of the fire behavior models are quite complex. They're very context specific. In other words, the results that you get depend on whether you're applying a model to a ponderosa pine forest and of certain characteristics, certain density and structure, or a lodgepole pine, or a spruce fir forest, and so on. And the results that you get of trying to predict fire behavior from these models depends greatly on the weather conditions that you assume to be operative during your fire event, especially wind speeds and amount of drought prior to and during the fire. So some of these models actually show a decrease, predict a decrease in fire activity in lodgepole pine stands, for example. And that's based on the argument that we have a decrease in the continuity of the crown fuels, of the needles in the crowns. And that's how the typical fire in lodgepole spreads, is from crown to crown. The models also, in some cases, show that there is likely to be an increased fire severity 10 or 20 years after a bark beetle outbreak. As a lot of trees fall to the ground, they result in a lot of coarse fuel on the ground, and that produces higher fire severity. But as I said, all of these predictions depend completely on fire weather scenarios. So the results that you get from the models depend on whether you assume that you have extreme wind conditions, extreme drought, or just sort of typical wind conditions and average moisture availability. There's a lot of very active research on this topic, because these fire behavior models were not created to deal with this sort of situation. They were not created to predict the outcome of dead fuels on fire behavior. So this is an area of a lot of active research right now. The main interpretations that I make from these modeling exercises is that fire severity can be greater following a beetle kill under certain specified weather scenarios. Generally, under the most extreme weather conditions, though, the dead fuels don't make any difference. And it's the most extreme weather conditions that we get any burning, any significant burning, in our high elevation lodgepole pine forests. So I'd say that the bark beetle outbreaks have not significantly changed the potential for fire behavior in the lodgepole pine forest, because the burning of those forests is so dependent on rare drought. A couple times a century, we get climate conditions similar to 2002, where you can get very extensive fires. And when we get that kind of drought, and if we get an ignition and it's associated with strong winds, it doesn't matter if the trees are dead or alive, we're going to have very widespread fire. It's more complicated in the ponderosa pine and Doug fir zone, because we've got a mosaic of different vegetation structures and so on, and there's less research that's been done on that zone. One of the key findings, though, is that, or at least interpretations, is that since under certain weather scenarios, fire severity may be, and fire behavior, like the speed with which a fire moves and the flame length and so on, may be much greater than what we would expect otherwise. Well, from a firefighting perspective, you need to take that into account. So that's really what's going to be the important result of these fire behavior models. These are going to be very useful in terms of firefighter safety and strategy of fighting fires with a bark beetle kill. So I want to talk about one of the elephants in the room that doesn't get any discussion, as far as I can tell. You don't see anything on any ballot about restricting residential development in Boulder County, but that's basically what this problem is all about. So in 1960, you can see the urban and suburban and the exurban areas in the red to the yellow colors here, and then the prediction for 2040, and we're basically experiencing a build out so that everywhere that it's safe to build a home in the montane zone is going to be occupied pretty much on up to the peak highway. There's very little discussion of that. We recently published a paper in which we ran one of those models under extreme weather conditions. The red basically indicates crown fire here. The darker green indicates more severe fire line intensity. And this just shows that basically the entire Front Range is capable of supporting high fire intensity. And historically, the residential development began first in the lower elevations, valley bottoms. Those were areas of less fire hazard, less potential fire intensity, but increasingly residential development is in the higher elevations, upper montane zone, even in lodgepole pine forests. The other elephant disgusted with the conversation at this point, is telling us that we're not paying much attention to the problems posed by warming. We've got plenty of evidence for warming in Colorado and the whole globe over the 20th century, and especially the last few decades. There's strong evidence that shows an increase in fire extent across Western North America tied to increased temperatures and the increased length of the fire season. This is something that's extremely well documented. And the best available predictions of future climate tell us that the kind of drought that we considered severe here in 2002, that in the future, that kind of drought is going to be the average condition. I'm not a climatologist, so don't blame me for the bad news, but it's something that we should be very, very concerned about. And most of this work is done in relation to water resources. Fire hasn't really gotten that much attention yet, but it's getting more attention. For example, the National Research Council recently published the synthesis on what the ecological or what the general impacts would be of a 1 degree increase in temperature during the next 50 years or so. And using existing data and an existing model that's been published and is very highly regarded for this purpose, they predict a 6-fold increase in fire occurrence in western Colorado. This is what we call a statistical model, so there are a lot of limitations to it, but it certainly tells us the direction. I don't want to bet on whether we're going to get a doubling or a 6-fold increase in fire occurrence or fire extent during any particular time period, but it certainly tells us that we expect that warming is going to increase the extent of burning. I mentioned a while ago how, based on our fire history research in Rocky Mountain National Park, a very large percentage of the spruce fir forest is not burned in the last 400 years. Well, this sort of modeling result predicts that a large part of it will burn in the next 400 years, or next few decades, actually. But we'll see. And there may be some analogs from the 19th century for such widespread fires. This map, centered on Grand Lake here, shows in this dark gray color an area that was burned in a single fire event in 1851. That was one of the driest years throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Everybody who's done fire history work from southern Colorado north through Wyoming records 1851 as one of the biggest fire events. And so in a single year, we had most of the lodgepole pine zone on the western side of Rocky Mountain National Park burn in one event. You can imagine how exciting it would be in Grand Lake if we have a similar sort of event. And I think things may be bad in Boulder County. This is an example of the kind of exurban development up around Winter Park, where people are building homes essentially under lodgepole pine stands. These are the lodgepole pine stands that originated after that 1851 fire. So I'll just end with this slide suggesting that what really needs to receive some discussion is how we're going to confront the problems posed by exurban residential growth and climate warming when we talk about fire mitigation and about adapting to fire hazards. Thanks very much.